All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome. I hope you had a nice week off last week. Winter break and the February break that actually seems like millions of years ago, but it was just last week. So today we're talking about a really heavy topic. We're talking about depression, and actually next week we're even going to be heavier because we're going to be talking about suicide next week. But these are really important topics for us to discuss with parents so that parents know what signs to look for. I've shared with all of you that my daughter has been diagnosed with depression and has had bouts of severe depression where she's had to be hospitalized. She did attempt suicide. So this is something that I am very well aware of. It's a painful topic for me. It's a topic I've been dreading because it is very painful for me to talk about this, but it is really, really important for us to talk about and for us as parents to know what to look for so that we can give the help to our children that they need. So I know, Yvonne, you have a presentation for us. And then, like I always, parents, if you have questions, put them in the chat. You can, of course, you can always take yourself off mute and actually verbalize your question if you want, whatever you need to do. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. I always remember these types of presentations when my kids were younger, and it felt so like separate from what I was doing and what they were doing. Like it didn't relate to us at all. And then as the years have gone by, just kind of reflecting on like, oh my gosh, like I have 3 kiddos and every one of them has had some sort of either episode of depression, thoughts of suicide, self-harm, like all these things that like I didn't like. It's like I know they happen to anyone, but as a mom, it was just like, no, like, we have a nice little family and I do everything I'm supposed to. Like it was weird. It's like, even though I knew that, like intuitively, like just to watch it kind of unfold, I'm like, wow, like it is so easy for depression to just kind of slide under the radar. And so this topic for me as well is a very like emotional topic, because thinking of like, I mean, obviously there's nothing more precious than our kiddos, and the thought of them not wanting to be here anymore is one, really painful, two, very personal. Like, what did I do wrong? Right. It's always kind of like look back at ourselves as like, what did I do? What should I have done differently? So my older son, when we were going through, I think it was the first year of the pandemic, was his senior year in high school. And he had done really well in school. And just to kind of watch him over those few months just kind of crumble, like his sleep pattern started to change. And I kind of like chalked it up to like, oh yeah, they're playing video games late at night. This is his social time. And it just kept getting like progressively worse, where I noticed, I'd come home, he'd be home at like 2:00 in the afternoon, just asleep, low energy, just very disconnected. And, I'd ask him like, are you okay? And he's like, well, everybody feels this way right now. And so I just kind of chalked it up to like pandemic, right? And so it wasn't until probably a year and a half in that we just got to talking, and I'm like, are you like really depressed? Like, are you okay? And he's like, duh. And I was like, oh. He's like, yeah, I've been depressed for like the last 2 years. And I said, oh, like, have you had any thoughts of suicide? And he again says, duh, like every day. And I'm like I knew it, but I didn't know it. And to hear it and to like think it are two different things. And so this was actually pretty recent. And so finally he's gotten into therapy. Last week was his first appointment. And I'm so happy. I'm so thankful. And that, like, looking back, I'm like, what's wrong with me? Why didn't I get him in there sooner? Why didn't I push it more then? It's like, we just don't know, right? We just don't know for sure what's going on with our kiddos. And so I feel guilty, right? I'm like, oh my gosh, the social worker's kids were depressed for 2 years and he never was given help. And another thing that I just had this with a parent just yesterday, where your kiddo starts to feel a little bit better, and it's very easy to just sweep it under the rug and move forward, because dealing with it head on means acknowledging that your kiddo's not okay. And so this is something that we see all the time of like, okay, they're not suicidal, they're not in the hospital, so let's just kind of move forward and move on. And I don't know what Kayla's perspective might be on this, but for me, This school year, I've seen more suicide attempts, more just like pervasive, like suicidal thoughts, than I have ever. Like it's really intense. Coming back from break was tough. We have kiddos that we're dealing with that, have had suicide attempts and are trying to move forward from there and, trying to support them the best that we can. But, nothing is more important than a family being aware of what's going on. We can only do so much. We can only see so much. And so we're really requiring all of us to just have like open eyes and open ears to what's going on with our kiddos. I am going to attempt to share my screen.
Yeah, I think like you were saying, it just feels so much more present, like just people having depressive thoughts and it just kind of immediately going to that really persistent suicidal thoughts. I haven't been in the field as long as Yvonne or at the school, but it seems, I worked at Independence for a year and it was a very different environment. I think we just had a lot more anxiety and anxious feelings there than suicidal thoughts, suicidal attempts. So it has been pretty heavy this year.
Sorry, guys. Something is going on with my stuff. I don't know that I'm going to be able to do that.
I was just very thankful because I was like, I don't think I would be able to share my screen at all. I don't remember how to do it.
Well, I think it's because I have a new, I'm going to share it with you, Jenny. I think it's because I have a new computer and it's saying I have to go into like my system stuff.
Yeah, just email it to me. And
Sorry, guys. And I think this is like across the board. I mean, talking to all of the other sites, I think all of us have felt this extra like heaviness this year, just coming back in general and just really busy. Like I say it over and over again, like if I didn't have Kayla this year, I'm not sure how I would have been able to do it because we're just like in the beginning of the year, just inundated with referrals. Thanks, Jenny. Yeah. Now I have to bug you to,
that's all right.
Change the slide.
That's okay. I'm here.
Next slide, please. Okay. So this beginning part, I'm kind of just going to skip through a little bit, but it just talks a little bit about like the stage of development that teenagers are in and why they're so susceptible to depression. I mean, if you can remember being in high school, being totally hormonal and moody. So that's like the norm already. Stress hormones, just like, psychological changes. We're trying to be independent at that time in our lives. We're trying to create our own identity and separate ourselves from our family, and just kind of questioning in general, like who we are. Those are big things. And as I've been like saying in the last couple of weeks, it's like all these things are normal teenage things. But on top of that, we're throwing on pandemic, global unrest, like all these very, very stressful things that I feel have just kind of been normalized for our teenagers of like, this is just what it is. And they think they're used to it. But what's going on inside of them might be something a lot deeper than what they're letting on the outside. They're very resilient, but they're also, holding on to a lot of this stuff. Next slide, Jenny.
I want to add a comment just because I feel like I've had a lot of students kind of self-diagnosing with like kind of serious personality disorders and things like that. Maybe like, I know there's like a big thing on TikTok about like self-diagnosing, but I always try to remind them like, one, what we've been going through the past couple of years takes such a big toll on your mental health. And also just where we are in development and age, like a lot of requirements for those serious personality disorders. Mm-hmm. But a lot of that can be explained by like the hormonal changes. So.
And back in my day, we didn't have the ability to Google what was wrong with us, right? So, I mean, I get kiddos that come in here that have like it all spelled out already. I think it's this, and this, which is fantastic to have that awareness about yourself. But it's also, a little unsettling that they've been, diving deep into the internet of like, what is wrong with me and trying to figure that out. So this just talks about the brain not being fully developed until the early 20s, which is a kind of scary thought given how many big decisions we're making when we're teenagers. I'm going to pass through this slide, Jenny, just because I got a lot of like depression stuff, but we can share this later. Go ahead,
Yes, I will
Mom.
send this out too.
No, perfect. So these are like the big obvious things. And unfortunately, these are not the things that we are going to necessarily hear from our children. It would be very rare if somebody were to just be like, hi, Mom, I'm depressed and I can't stop crying. Like, that's probably not going to happen. That might be something that they share with their peers, but this might not be something that they're sharing with their parents at home. I'm depressed. I can't stop crying. I'm so stressed out. I can't take it. This is something that, Kayla and I might hear regularly on the daily. You don't understand how I feel. Life just isn't worthwhile. And these are all big flags for us of like, these statements come up after somebody's likely been suffering for a while. So it's not just something like, I'm having a bad day and this comes up. This is like something where kiddos are really in their head and just kind of thinking about how they're feeling and how they're doing. And this is something that would come up for us. But I don't know about any of the parents, if any of their children have come right out and said that, and just so you know, it doesn't make you a good or extra great parent if that does happen. Communication is different with our kiddos, and all of our kids are different. Like I have one kiddo that would come right out and tell me, and I have one that would never tell me, and I would have never known had I not like found out on his phone, right? And so it doesn't mean that you're a bad parent. It's part of that natural like teenage development to separate themselves from the family and to become independent, right? So I'm depressed. I can't stop crying. I'm so stressed out. I can't take it. Life just isn't worthwhile. I can't do this anymore. I don't know how much longer I can go on. Those are things that we, unfortunately are hearing pretty regularly. Next slide, Jenny.
Did it go?
Yeah. So one of the ways we assess kiddos is it's a form, and you'll see it like at doctor's offices. It's called a PHQ-9. And what it is it's 9 questions related to how that student's been feeling over the last, is it 2 weeks, Kayla? I can't remember if it's been over like the last 2 weeks.
It is 2 weeks. Yeah.
And the questions are pretty much kind of right on with this slide right here. And so just thinking about yourself, thinking about your teen years, these are questions that you might not know about your own kiddo. The first one is in regards to like what we call anhedonia, just like lack of pleasure. Like if you loved playing golf and all of a sudden it just doesn't even sound fun anymore, that might be a symptom of depression. Not enjoying things that you used to enjoy. Like literally the joy feels like it got sucked out of your life. I just want to roll over in the morning and stay in bed all day, or I wake up earlier than I want. It's so easy to confuse depression and laziness, right? Like as a parent, I'm like, yeah, you're just being lazy. But when I really like reflect on what depression feels like, in my own experience, I went through a really bad postpartum depression after one of my sons was born. And one of the things that really sticks out into my head was the inability to get out of my bed. Like it was like not just like a mental thing, but like a physical thing where I literally felt like I had cement blocks on my back and I could not physically lift myself out of the bed. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't quite know or understand, is that it is physical. And we'll talk a little bit about the physical symptoms too, of like your kiddo literally cannot stand up in the morning. There were days where a shower on the to-do list is literally the only thing you can achieve, and maybe not even being able to. So those are things that kind of just go to show like how physical it actually is. So as a parent, sometimes, even me, I've been tempted to be like, snap out of it. Let's go. We got to go. Just push through. And it's something that they're not even capable of doing. And so just being aware of like how intense these feelings can be. And obviously this is like when things progress to a little more intense. I don't want to eat. So changes in appetite. Is your kiddo eating? Do they eat more than usual? Like what's going on with their appetite? And you are the expert of your child. Their sleeping patterns, mostly their eating patterns. And like, are you noticing anything that's different? I just don't care about anything or anyone anymore. Maybe your kiddo was super social. Maybe they used to come to the dinner table. Maybe you're noticing that things are just feeling a little bit different. They're just maybe a little more disconnected. When I give these scales out to kiddos, one of the ones that I always have kiddos check mark the box is I feel worthless and I feel like I'm a disappointment to myself and my family. That's like one that always stands out. And whether or not we're even feeding that to them as parents or not, that's just something that they're internalizing. Like, I'm worthless. I'm not good at this. I'm not good at anything. My parents must be so disappointed. Another one I'll hear is like, my parents have sacrificed so much. Like, I'll have kiddos that say like, my parents left their country, came here for me to have a better opportunity, and I can't even get this right. What's the point? They would be better off without me. Like, that thought progression goes that quickly.
So that was definitely my experience with my daughter. And I have, just so people know, I have a very close relationship with my daughter. I was texting with Yvonne and Kayla yesterday about some things that she's told me recently that I'm like, oh, I wish I didn't know that. So sometimes it's too close. But we are very close, but she did not share with me her depression. And she later told me, she was like, I didn't want you to worry, because I've always, like, my son has always been our more difficult child. We're always worried about him with school and just struggles that he has. And she's like, you're already worrying about Nathan. I didn't want you to have to worry about me too. You're so busy. I didn't, want to be a burden. And just that, like, she just didn't tell me. Mm-hmm. And, it sucked.
Yeah, that's always the one. I don't want to worry my parents. They have enough on their plate. I don't want them to have to take time off work to come down here and talk to you. And it's like, as a parent, it's like, something's off with your kiddo. So I tell them, I said, your parent already knows that you're not okay. And their imagination is probably really dramatic right now. So it's probably better that we tell them, and that might actually be helpful and not harmful. But it makes you question your parenting, right? Like, oh my gosh, we talk about everything. Like, why did you, it's personal. It becomes personal. Like, why didn't you trust me? What could I have done differently for you to trust me? And it's like, and it's not really that. It's like, you could be the best, most open-minded parent, and they still are like, I don't want to burden my mom with, these feelings that I'm having. I think the feelings they don't realize are so common that they're almost like ashamed of having them, and like, I don't want to bog down my parents with what's going on. They've got financial issues, they've got things going on, and it's like, I'm just going to handle this on my own. Irritability and frustration is so like a part of being a teenager. Like, if I could like count how many times I rolled my eyes at my mom when I was 16 years old, I couldn't even count that high. I was always irritable. I was always just like frustrated with anything anybody told me to do. And so it's hard sometimes to differentiate, like, is that depression? Was I depressed, or was I just being a hormonal teenager? And I think, again, your kiddo enough to know, like, are you seeing these behaviors like more frequently now? Like, what's going on? Have you noticed any change? And then feeling like nothing's ever going to get better. Depression is like this weird black cloud that just kind of follows you around. And it's almost like you can't see through that, like fog. And it just feels like no matter what anybody tells you, no matter what you've learned, no matter how many people you see better, you always feel like your case or your situation is the worst and there's no hope for you. Next slide, Jeannie. I feel like there's a question.
There's a good question in the chat. How do you bring this up with your teen if they're always annoyed with you when you try to talk to them, which I think is very real, especially teenagers. They're like, I'm good, I'm fine, whatever, leave me alone, even though these things are important to talk about.
Yeah, I think, did you want me to answer that?
I was like, yeah, this might be a question for Ginny or Yvonne too, how you've handled it as parents.
Yeah.
With me, and I gotta say, like, all those signs that Yvonne if they were there in my daughter, I wrote it off as normal teenager stuff. I totally did. I was like, I work with teenagers. I've worked with teenagers for 20 years. I know teenagers. And I was like, that's just normal teenage stuff. What she said to me, I think I need to see a therapist. And that was like, oh, and I used Yvonne, and I'm like, let me talk to Hannah. And it was Yvonne that was like, yeah, no, she's really depressed. So if they say something like that to you, like, oh, I think I need to talk to somebody, that's them like crying out for help. And they may be like do it in a nonchalant way, but take that very, very seriously. I would use this, use it, say like, hey, the principal did this thing on depression, and like, how, you could, use their friends. Like, do you have any friends that have been depressed? Have you like, have that start a conversation of like, well, have you ever felt that way? Just totally, and you can just be like, well, that the principal said I needed to ask you about this, and use me. It's totally fine.
Like, yeah, and if you ever need to talk to anyone, let us know. We'll set it up. I think conversations with kiddos, it's like sometimes you just have to start like with regular stuff, right? Like my kids talk to me more than they talk to my husband because I've talked to them about like silly, mindless, pointless things. And so for me, it's a lot easier to bring it up. But I know that that's a very real thing of like it being very difficult. When I bring up stuff like this at home, my kids are like, Mom's social working us again. So they've already got this like wall of like, oh brother, Mom's being dramatic and Mom's being a social worker. But I like the way Jenny said it, of just kind of normalizing it. Like, yeah, she said to ask everyone. It's not, like I'm just like zoning in on you because I'm worried about you. It's just because I guess that's what I'm supposed to do as a mom, and then just kind of see how that goes. I like that. Then it just becomes normal. Like, oh, everybody's talking about this now.
And I want to also encourage just to be persistent with support, even when they are annoyed, or when they seem annoyed. I remember having a really like heated conversation with my mom when I was in high school. I think my depression when I was in high school looked a lot just like anger with her. And I remember her being like, what am I doing wrong? Like, why are you so angry with me? And I was pushing her away the whole time. But I also I needed her to continue asking me. And I told her, I was like, I need you here, but I'm going to hate you through it. But I need you here. I need you to ask me. So I think even if they are annoyed, they're still going to need you to ask them. And they still want that.
Like my poor mother. I was so mean. There's different types of depression. There's major depression, like major diagnosable depression. There's something called dysthymia, which is kind of like this low persistent mood where maybe you don't feel like the lowest you've ever felt, but you just don't feel well, and you're kind of just like lower than you usually are. It's just this like I don't know if you can describe that better, Kayla, but like just this like always kind of blah, always kind of down.
I sorry, I cut out for a second. Are we talking
about I was just talking about dysthymia, and like I was trying to explain it. It's just kind of like this like persistent low mood, but not necessarily like a crash out like depression. It's not I feel fun by any means.
I hear it described as just kind of like numb, maybe like apathetic, just like you're just existing, kind of
existing. That's a good
nothing
one.
No normal like emotion wave or anything.
Like we'll ask kids like from 1 to 10, how are you doing? 10's great, and 1's, and they're like 5. Like always just 5. And I think there's this misconception that we're supposed to be happy all the time. We're not. Our moods are intended to fluctuate, but it's just monitoring like how far are they fluctuating, how frequently are they fluctuating. Reactive depression is like, it's a depressive episode that's precipitated by a situation. So it's situational, right? Something happened. Maybe there was a breakup, maybe there was a death in the family, maybe there was something traumatic that happened, and that's like depression that comes as like a reaction to that event. And then manic depression is just, it's, bipolar depression. That's a whole nother level of depression. The commonality between all these things is just that feeling of feeling sad, down, blue. Clinical depression, I believe, is like diagnosed over like, I think it's 6 months, like certain symptoms that have been persistent over 6 months. And I think that's what made it really difficult during the pandemic, because we were all kind of blah. I was starting to feel apathetic. And so it was more difficult to diagnose during that time because everybody kind of felt crummy. And we were all experiencing that, some level of depression. These statistics have changed, and I'm actually oops, this is not right. So in 2012, where it says 2021, 5% of teens had major depression. That was in 2012.
Wondering, I'm like, that can't be right.
No. Sorry. I just like my numbers backwards. And then in 2018, we're seeing 15%. Now, remind you, this is before the pandemic. The CDC doesn't have any more recent than 2018 statistics on teen depression. So 15% before the pandemic. I don't know what it is right now. I can imagine that it's higher, just based on my day-to-day here, just the work, my own kids, just like all of that, everything I've heard from other people in the district and just like everywhere, like it's an epidemic, our mental health right now.
Mm-hmm. I know we've had like an astronomical like increase in referrals and everything. And I also think about, these are only the kids who teachers notice, parents notice, or that they come to us. And there's so many other students who are probably going through it that are just quiet and get good grades. So they kind of go unnoticed.
Yeah. We have a lot of good actors here.
Mm-hmm.
Be like, how do you hold it together? Like, I just keep smiling and keep moving on because that's what I'm supposed to do. Next slide, Jeannie. So again, just more of those symptoms of just that empty mood. I think that's such a big one of like, I just feel numb. I just don't care. Pessimistic about everything. That guilt and that worthlessness again about like, my family did so much. I have one job and I can't even do that, right? We start to see a lot of like, how this impacts them academically, right? It is difficult to concentrate and remember things in class. If you're not feeling, motivated by anything, like what makes us think that they're going to even care to do their math homework? And this is difficult too, because we have so many kiddos who do well, they push through and they get straight A's. So we're like, oh, well, they must be okay. Because they, if they were really depressed, they'd have difficulty concentrating. So just remember that like everybody responds to depression differently, right? I have a lot of kids who do really well in school. They push through, they don't get a lot of rest, they're getting their homework done, but then they're self-harming, right? And so it just depends on the kiddo and how, it shows up for them, right? We kind of assume that they're just like lazy and don't get out of bed and don't go to school, but we have the total opposite as well. It's like they're doing too much school, they're fully engaged in it, they're making sure everything's perfect, but then they're kind of crumbling when they're at home or, not in school. I noticed break was difficult for a lot of kiddos. And I think it's that like structure of having to get up in the morning and then, you hit that week of break and you just have this lull of like nothingness. Mm-hmm. And that I notice has been a really big trigger for a lot of our kids. Sleep. I don't know about everybody else, but I feel like my kids have never recovered from the pandemic sleep habits. They're up later than they ever were. It's very difficult to get them to go to sleep. They're waking up late. It's definitely been a challenge for me at home. I know this is something that I hear from other families as well. Let's see. We're going to talk a little bit about the physical stuff. Go ahead and change to the next slide, Jenny. People assume that like mental health stuff is all mental, but the mind and body connection is so strong. And like I was talking about, just that like pile of bricks on your body, like what that feels like. There's so many other physical symptoms. And so when I talk to kiddos who I find out are like depressed or feeling anxious, I always ask them like, have you ever not come to school because of this? And most of them will say yes. And a lot of the reason why is because it manifests as like a physical symptom, right? They get tension in their shoulders, they get bad headaches. I'll have kids describe this like almost like they're wearing a tight band on their forehead, like all the tension in the top of their head. Stomach aches are huge. Tight chest, dry mouth, just sleep difficulties, just overall this feeling of feeling yucky. Like sometimes like kids will say like, how are you doing? They're like, I'm okay. Like, and I'll ask them like, what's the real answer? Like, if you really could describe like what you're really feeling, what would you say? And they'll say something like, I just feel crummy all over. My body feels crummy. I feel like I have no energy. I feel aches and pains. And that actually could be, a symptom of depression. I always say, make sure you rule it out with the doctor, make sure there's nothing else going on. And once we eliminate that worry, then it's like a lot of times we just have to remember that this does manifest as something physical. And if your kiddo is constantly complaining of like ailments and you're taking them to the doctor and nothing's coming of those appointments and they're saying that they're fine, this could be something that might be going on. Next slide. When should I be concerned? I tend to be an anxious mom, so I'm always kind of concerned, but I think it's definitely looking for that change in behavior. Your kiddo, what's looking different? Parents are usually on. I'll have parents like I can't tell parents what's going on in our sessions, but sometimes parents will check in and just let me know like, hey, I'm noticing something different. And when I'm talking in the student, I'll notice that they always kind of line up. When mom's worried, student always does have something going on. Maybe mom doesn't know what that is, but they're always in tune. Dad knows that, so-and-so looks like this every day, and this morning just didn't get dressed quite the same, wasn't wearing the makeup they normally wear, just all those little things, just looking for any changes in behavior. I always, I don't want people to be too hyper vigilant because I don't want you to worry, but I also want you to just be aware of what's going on. Trust your gut, your kid. It's very rare that that's wrong and that there's something, even if you don't find out what that something is, the likelihood of you being correct is pretty high. I know we're going to get into this a little more next week. Yes, next week. It is by far for me the scariest part of my job. I've had students that I've checked in with and then 2 weeks later have tried to kill themselves. And I did my assessment and I thought I knew and I asked all the right questions and nothing comes up. And then I get a phone call from a parent that my kiddo was almost successful, in their attempt. And I'm just like reeling over it. I'm just like, what did I miss? And I think that's the scariest part is sometimes the signs are not outward. Sometimes your kid is that overachiever who is making friends, has friends. You don't notice anything, seems like they're in a good mood all the time. And that freaks me out. I'll be honest. Like that is for me the biggest stressor of just like not knowing. I've heard different things where people say like, oh, you usually know they're going to, oh, you usually don't know they're going to. Like in my experience, I didn't know. Like I really I look at the signs and I think when somebody is in a really bad headspace, a lot of times they really internalize it and don't want to share it and don't want to be open about it. And it's somebody who doesn't want to burden somebody else. They don't want to burden their friends and their family. And I think that's part of it of like, I want to remove myself from being a burden to these people. And so again, for me, it's just very scary of like, man, if it was foolproof and I could just do these assessments and know that it was going to be okay, that would make my job a lot easier, but it's not. Kids are unpredictable. Sometimes they're impulsive. This has actually moved to the second leading cause of death in adolescents between the ages of 12 and 17. There are things that kind of exacerbate this risk. And one of the things that we always talk about is like a kiddo support network is like one of the most important things. I think sleep and support network are like the two biggest like saving graces, if you will, for kiddos and things that are the biggest protective factor is having people that are there, having people that you can go to. Alcohol and substance abuse. Kids always ask me like, Miss Country, what do you think about, drugs and alcohol? Because my mom says I shouldn't smoke. And this is something that always comes to mind. If you're already in a bad space and you're using drugs or alcohol to manage depression and anxiety, this is a huge concern for me, because if things do go south with your mental health, which they could with, like alcohol, it's like a depressant and can make things worse. Drugs and alcohol make it easier for kiddos to make really terrible, impulsive decisions. And so for me, when I think of drugs, like that's one of the questions that I'll always ask is like, what are you using? What are you using it for? How often are you using it? Because I know a lot of kiddos who have attempted suicide were also drinking to make that decision easier for them. And so, if your kiddo's drinking, your kiddo's depressed, this for me is like a really huge red flag and indicator. Previous suicide attempts, that's always something we ask as well. Have you done this before? There is a higher likelihood, obviously, that they will continue to make those attempts. And that's something that I want to know. So that's something that increased the risk for me. And I think this is why the pandemic was so bad, is because it forced a lot of people to be alone and isolated. And that's another thing that increases the risk of suicide, is being alone and isolated. Like everything that we tell teenagers not to do to ward off depression are the things that they were forced to do over the pandemic. Being alone, being isolated. That was a really scary time. And so coming back out into the world, I know has been a big transition, but I'm also very grateful that kiddos are not so, hopefully, stuck in their house, in their room. Scary. Yeah. Next slide. I think this is a video. Yeah.
At Sprague High School in Salem, students are greeted with words of encouragement. These signs of hope sprouted from tragedy after the loss of 3 students who died by suicide last year.
Ben was amazing. He was always smiling, he had a great smile, just lights up the room.
Carol and Kyle McMahon remember their son Ben as a history buff who loved to cook. The 14-year-old was passionate about football. You could see it in his face.
He was happy. He didn't lead on to any anxiety or depression, anything that we would have said, hey, let's intervene.
Ben died on September 16th, 2018. 17 days later, another Sprague student, Aaron Brown, took his life.
I think it just knocked people for a loop.
Aaron was a good kid with a lot of friends who became an Eagle Scout. He came from a good family. His father, Dr. David Brown, is the longtime choir director at Sprague.
He had 2 supportive parents, had a good home life, was doing well in school, had lots of friends.
Dr. Brown says the loss of his son proves anyone is vulnerable to suicide.
If a kid like Aaron could get to that point, then anybody can.
And the first step to address this crisis is to talk about it.
I think the stigma that has been around suicide needs to change.
Both McMahons and Dr. Brown agree parents can help identify problems by digging deeper.
We have to learn to start asking questions in different ways. Open-ended questions instead of closed-ended questions. Tell me about your English class. And then, let them talk.
Then remind your kids it'll be okay. They'll get past the pressures of high school, which at the time can feel insurmountable.
There's help and support out there. Hey, how we doing?
Sprague principal Craig Swanson admits teens are especially vulnerable to suicide.
We've got to keep talking about this because it is an epidemic.
These messages of hope and inspiration are helping, along with counseling and suicide prevention programs. Swanson said there are countless untold stories of students who got help by speaking up.
To see them go off and be successful and to be happy in life is a great source of pride.
The families of Aaron and Ben believe we all have a role to play in preventing suicide. We need to look for changes in behavior and mood and ask about it.
It's everybody looking out, because you never know who that person they're just going to open up to.
And if something doesn't seem right, speak up, because you can save a life.
It truly takes a village.
It's a teacher, it's coworker, family, friends.
At Sprague High School in Salem.
And I was a parent, and that's just the most frightening thought. I didn't even realize in the video I'm watching, I'm like, oh gosh, I have a 14-year-old son that plays football. Like really, like you just don't know. And it's not intended to be like to scare you, but it is just that awareness of like, man, these kiddos' feelings run so deep and they're so not open and vulnerable with them sometimes with us. And it's just like, we don't know truly what's going on. I was kind of watching all these different stories last night to decide which video I wanted to show. And all of them were very similar of like, they seem so happy. I noticed a few things here and there, but they just seem so happy. And just remembering again, like how good of actors we have here on campus.
One thing though about that video that I'm going to disagree with, because he says in there, like, well, you have to have the message, it will get better. And yeah, they can get better. But I know as a parent with a child with depression, like one thing that we've had to deal with is that this is something she's going to deal with for life. I mean, she like has depressive periods, and it's never gotten as bad as it was, but we had to go through a lot of therapy, and we went through family therapy that we now know like how to deal with it as a family. And like, I'll remind her like, okay, well, this is, something you can do right now to like make you feel better. But it's something that like, it just doesn't go away. So I want to caution parents to be like, oh yeah, I know you're depressed right now, and being very sympathetic and be like, it'll go away.
Yeah.
No.
I love that you said that, because that's very like that, like toxic positivity, right? Like it's just like easy to say all the things that you think are going to make somebody feel better, but is that the reality? Like I'm 43 years old and I still deal with anxiety, and it's not what it was, and I know how to manage it the way it was, but it is something that is a part of who I am and a part of my life. And same with periods of depression. And I don't want people to be like, oh, it's eventually going to go away and then it's going to be okay. Because yeah, sometimes you have to learn all of those skills and strategies to learn how to cope with the things that you might be dealing with all your life. Depression is very hereditary, right? And sometimes it is that like reactive depression, but a lot of times for a lot of people, it is something that is, hereditary, something that we can't fight. And so just making sure that they have the skills to get through it. I'm so grateful my kids experienced this as they were younger, because I feel like moving into adulthood, they're more equipped to handle it as it comes up than being, I always say, like, I'm glad that all these kiddos are going through these things while they're still at home with us and we can keep our eye on them, than if they were, in their 20s and on their own. Mm-hmm. Our kids are so resilient. I'm always like astonished at how much they can endure, how much they can handle, but I do know that they're still kids and they're still sensitive. Resiliency, know your kid. It varies. Some of our kids are more resilient than others. Some of them are harder on themselves. Some of them have better coping skills. This second one here of comparing your kiddos to their siblings, to their peers. I hear this all the time. I do this all the time. I don't do it to my kid's face sometimes, but I'm like, man, my first two were so much easier than number 3 in school, and that's the kind of a narrative that he hears and he probably is like feeling yucky about. I have students tell me like, man, I wish I could perform the way that my cousin who went to Berkeley does. And my parents always bring her up, and sometimes it's intended to be in a positive, like constructive way of like encouraging you to be like your cousin. But what it really, kids start to internalize that and feel like they're never going to match up to that. They're never going to be that kiddo. It helps to know your child's capacity for stress and adjust your expectations to align with your kid's ability. And that's so true. Like some kids have the ability to handle a lot more, but maybe older sibling was able to endure 5 AP classes and do all that stuff, but maybe kiddo number 2 is just not quite to that same level, like not pushing them to be something that maybe they just aren't. Encourage your kiddo to pace themselves and set realistic expectations for themselves. We can encourage them all day long, but it comes down to like how they, what their self-talk looks like, what their expectations of their self look like. And, I know, again, parents always get a bad rap, but, kids put a lot of pressure on themselves to do well, to be perfect, to impress their parents, to not disappoint anyone. And a lot of times that's, that's detrimental to their health. What can you do? Talking. I know it's annoying. They think we're annoying and they roll their eyes. Cars are times in my life where I have a captive audience. Was there a question in there I couldn't get?
Yeah. It was a comment, just having a kid who's also on the autism spectrum. I'm assuming they said spectrum, that they're extra watchful.
Yep. I you hit a nerve with me. My number 3 is on the autism spectrum, and I feel like he has the deepest, strongest feelings of the 3, but the least ability to really verbalize that. And it makes me nervous. You know, like I found out he was self-harming through looking at his phone. And when I looked at his phone, the depth of his conversations with other people were such a shock to me, because I just assumed that he had these like very topical friendships. And when I realized like how deeply invested he was in these things, I would have never known that just based on like watching him interact with people. He's definitely the one that I worry the most about, I guess. He gives me the least feedback. And so I just like wonder like, what is going on in there? What are you thinking about? Have an honest conversation with your child about workload, expectations, stress, mental health, any noted concerns. You know, maybe they'll come to you and tell you that they're feeling stressed about a particular class. And, you know, instead of doing the normal, like, okay, study harder, maybe that would be a good time to interject that question of like, how is this workload? Does this feel manageable for you? Like, how are you feeling? And I did like that the guy mentioned open-ended questions, because it's so easy to just say, how was your day? Fine. And you don't get a whole lot, and they don't have the opportunity to really share. And when they do finally share, just making sure that we're listening. That's it. Not saying anything, not offering advice, but just listening. Know the warning signs of prolonged stress, anxiety, and depression. This looks different for different people. Some people might start to look more irritable. Some people might start to look more withdrawn and tired. Just knowing your kiddo and knowing what stress looks like for them. If you are worried about suicide, ask it. It was so weird when I decided to ask my son. I just asked it because I felt like that's what I was supposed to do. And when he said yes, it threw me back a little bit. I was like, oh, that was like the natural question I was supposed to ask, but I just totally didn't expect him to say yes. And I think he probably saw it on my face, like, and then he was surprised that I was surprised. So ask, you know, when clients come in, we are very direct about that. We don't just like, so have you ever, maybe not. We're just like, have you ever had thoughts of suicide? Have you ever attempted suicide? If so, what, you know, and I tend to not speak that way in front of my kids. Some people feel like if you talk directly about suicide, you're going to plant seeds of suicide in your kid. They already know what that is. They already know we're not going to add anything to them by asking. We're only going to open up that line of conversation. Help them develop. Go ahead.
I just want to emphasize using the word suicide. I think I have a lot of students who have persistent thoughts of suicide, but they'll describe it as they're not feeling well. So I think they'll use different terms if they don't want to talk about it. But if you ask directly and use the word suicide, yeah, that'll be helpful.
Very much tiptoed around for sure. Help your kid develop a game plan to combat stress. And I think the best way we could do that is modeling that. How are you managing your stress? Do you look like you're running around in a frenzy all the time and your kids are like not thinking you're the person to go to figure out how to manage stress? Like, what does that look like in your house? Encouraging socialization is so important, yet it's so difficult when your kiddo is maybe not doing so well in school. Like the last thing you're inclined to do when your kid is struggling in school is tell them to go hang out with their friends. Like it's like counterintuitive, but making sure they have some sort of outlet. You know, parents always think like you can see your friends at school all day. They don't actually have that much time to interact with their peers at school. So just making sure that they are prioritizing that part of their life, because being connected is such a huge protective factor for them. Recognize that your child needs balance. I was talk about with kids, like every part of your life is important. Your friendships, your family, your home environment, your school stuff, your health, your mental health, your exercise. And we forget that there's so many pieces of them, and we focus on, you know, the school one or the family one, but we have to remember that they are these holistic beings that have all these parts to them that all require attention. Encourage stress relievers. It says go dark regarding screens. That's a hard one. Hard for me, maybe. I think there's another slide, Jenny. Things to say, you know, it's going to be okay is like, you know, like Jenny was saying, maybe not right away. Maybe that's not, maybe we don't want to give them this false sense of everything's going to be perfect, but thanking them for being open. Like, thank you for telling me that. Like, is there anything I could do to help? I'm sorry to hear that. It must be really difficult for you. Well, this sounds like our job, Kayla.
I
All
know.
those phrases.
I'm here for you when you need me.
I'm here. You know where to find me.
Mhm.
You know, I can't imagine what you're going through. Something that frustrates kids is when people say, like, I know, I've been there. Or, oh, when I had it worse, like when we had to like one up our kids, like, oh, you think you had it hard. I had to do that, but I didn't even have a phone, you know. But just like meeting them where they are and not using your own struggles to kind of one up them or invalidate their struggle. I've noticed changes lately. Just wanted to check in with you. You know, I noticed that you've been in your room a lot more. Is, you know, what's going on? Is there anything that, you know, is different right now? Like trying to ask like specific questions. Because if we say, how are you? 99% of the time, they're going to say fine. I would put it out there too. Like if you wanted someone to talk to that isn't me, like, let me know. I will set that up. Feeling this way is like normal. It's not a sign of weakness. It actually takes more courage to talk about it. So I appreciate you sharing that with me. Those are things that will encourage your kids to say more. But not to say it could be worse. It could always be worse. There's always somebody who has it worse off than you. Kayla, you probably get this too. I get a lot of kids are like, I want to make an appointment, but I don't want to take up the time from somebody who really needs it. And I'm like, well, you just told me you want to kill yourself. So I think, you know, but it's like every struggle is valid. Every struggle is important. There are always going to be somebody worse, but that doesn't mean that yours isn't important. Deal with it. Snap out of it. Everyone feels that way sometimes. If somebody's trying to tell you that they're not okay and you're like, oh, that's pretty normal, everybody feels like that, you've just closed that door on getting them the support that they might be needing. We've all been there. Pull yourself together. Think happier thoughts. Stop stressing. Don't talk about those feelings. It'll make you more sad. What could you possibly have to be depressed about? Dad and I pay the bills and we pay the rent and you just have to go to school. Like what else do you need? Let's see. Is that it? Do we have one more? I'm gonna pass this one. Screen time is a whole nother rabbit hole that we can go down at some point.
Yeah, and I feel like we've talked about it.
We did too.
We have.
Yeah, sleep is a whole nother one too. I'm telling you, there is nothing better than a full night of sleep, but we can't force our kids to do that. We can force them into their room, but we don't know what happens beyond that. But good sleep, man, if you have to pick between studying for your final and going to sleep, go to sleep. Poor babies. More sleep stuff. Did we already do our sleep presentation or is that coming?
I think we have done that this year.
Okay. Sleep hygiene.
Is that the last slide?
I think it might be. Okay, cool. Yes. So yes, heavy topic, I know. And this is just like,
I stop sharing.
Oh, yes. This is just like that awareness of like, man, our kids have so many feelings that run so deeply and we don't always know what they are. And however we can encourage them to open up those lines of communication, to know that we're okay, to know that they're not okay. You know, we always ask our kids like, hey, I'd really like to talk to your parent because they're part of your support system. Can I call? Many times my kids are like, yeah, like they wanted that. They needed that bridge because it's scary. You don't want to disappoint your parents. You don't want to freak them out. And, you know, I've seen kids all the time be well, do okay, thrive.
Yvonne, there's a question in here asking for your contact information. It's actually both Yvonne and Kayla. If you could put your contact information,
Yeah, of course.
And then I'll actually put that in my email when I send it out to parents, and this reporting out to parents later on today. One thing I want to say from a parent, I know this is a really scary topic, and like the worst thing that you want to deal with as a parent is to have your kid be depressed and be suicidal, and it's just it's an awful feeling. I shared, I've been there. It's awful. And it's hard work to get through it. And it's hard work as a family because it affects the entire family. It affects their siblings. Obviously the parents, of course, the child themselves, but it is a whole family, even the grandparents, like it's everybody that has to really kind of like get involved in the healing and so that they do come out of it. And like I said, like it is something that, you know, depression, unless it's like you were saying, the reactionary depression where something had happened and they're having a depressive episode, you know, it is something that if they have major depression, or with my daughter, I feel like my daughter probably has the more bipolar depression. It's something that they have to learn to deal with and cope with. And that's what you really want to like help them with, is like coming up with those coping strategies so that they do get past this and like learn how to survive with it.
And if you ever have any questions or just want to consult with one of us about like, you know, I'm feeling like this might be a sign, what do you think? Like, let us know. That's what we're here for. You know, if you have any questions, if you want to process through any of that, if you just need any suggestions, like shoot us an email. If you call us, we're never going to answer during the day because we're always with kids. So we'll get back to you like later on, and hopefully, but email is best for me. I don't know if I can speak for Kayla, but it is definitely.
Any suggestion regarding how to cope when one sibling leaves for college? This is actually, we're going to talk about this. And I think, give us a month. We are going to talk about this topic.
Yeah. You know what I didn't realize, Jenny, is like, because my kid lives at college. It's at San Jose State. I know I'm dramatic, but it's hard. Every weekend he comes home and leaves. I have this like heartbreak, and his siblings have the same heartbreak. It's a thing. We'll talk about it.
We're going to cover this topic. Don't worry. So I'm going to let you guys go today. I know this is a heavy topic, but like I said, it's such an important topic. Next week's going to be heavy too, probably even heavier because we're talking about suicide. But again, really, really important. Thank you, parents, for joining us. I hope that you have a wonderful day. Enjoy the weather today, because I think it's supposed to get cold again. So enjoy today. All right. Thank you, guys.
Bye, everyone.